Hello, I'm Stevie Thurston and welcome back to The Wounded Man. This week we're going back to look at the article on skeletal trauma in the Journal of Forensic Anthropology. We did a brief overview of it last week. This is more of an appendix looking specifically at the blunt force trauma. Blunt force trauma is very wide ranging, and because of that there's been relatively little study into the subject specifically. Although we can understand what forces were involved and how they created the breaks, and it can give us insights on angles of attack and that kind of thing, trying to narrow it down to any kind of weaponry becomes very difficult, and because of that there's just not the research done, and people, it's futile, and that's sort of acknowledged by the forensics community. But to understand how those breaks and things happen, you have to have a little bit of an understanding of the biomechanical nature of bone. It's a composite structure that exhibits what is called viscoelastic properties. Visco meaning thick liquid, and living bone is not solid in the way that we might expect it. The stuff that you pick up from the supermarket or the butchers is already gone through a process of rigour, so it is significantly harder than it is when it's living in the bone, in the body, and elastic. It's flexible and it bends. And if you've cooked it, bone's even harder still. So so it's viscoelastic property. It's a thick liquid-like thing that's elastic, and we know that it bends before it breaks. And I think we're all familiar with that. It is also transversely isotopic, which basically means its line of resistance are in a single plane. So when we look at the long bones, we've got the long lengths. They're invariably meant for taking force along that length in the same plane in which they're created. So any lateral force there starts to break them, or any non-linear force in its plane. So if we're twisting, things like that, these all create breaks. As well as being influenced by its biomechanical properties, it's influenced by its shape and also its age and its health. We all know little children don't break their bones quite as often because their bones are softer and more elastic. As we age, they become harder. And then obviously there are health things, there are diseases and illnesses that will impede the strength of the bone, and things like rickets start to cause deformities again. So shape influenced by all those sorts of things. And basically the deformation of the bone, a break or the fractures or whatever, occurs because of the bone's inability to disperse the energy that's been applied to it. So it's obviously, it can take a certain amount of energy. Once it's dissipated as much energy as it can, it then breaks. And there are three basic types of breaks. There's a bending break, due to being struck. In our case is probably the sort of thing that we're going to look at, as external force hits onto the arm. That causes the bone to bend. If there's too much energy there, then that will obviously break, and it creates a distinct type of break. There is then twisting forces. Twisting, so if you see it in footballers and things, when they're twisting, because the studs cause them to pivot on the ground, the twist comes through and that creates spiral fractures. There is potential that we might actually find some of these, so the skeletal populations we'll be looking at in the future. There are grappling systems which do include arm locks and things like that, and that's about applying often joint twisting forces to damage ligaments and tendons, but also potentially damage the bone. And then there are compression breaks. This is where the energy is applied in the plane of the bone, but there's just simply too much energy there for the bone to be able to deal with. We're probably not going to see an awful lot of this. You might see some in spinal injuries, which be due to activities that may be associated with military endeavours but aren't necessarily martial techniques related. Generally, you're not going to find them in what we're looking at. You're talking much more of sort of car crashes and things where there's a lot of force applied along the lengths, and it just can't cope with it, and it just literally creates what's called a transverse fracture. So we probably don't expect to see a significant number of those. It all gets quite interesting then when we start looking at skeletal remains. So this is covered the brief bit there of what is blunt force trauma. So when we start looking at groups like the Towton mass grave, So we've got over 30 bodies there, and there is really no true, or what we would realistically call true, blunt force trauma. We're seeing fractures caused by weapons, but they're partly as a continuation of what this article at least would call sharp force trauma. Where we do see them, it is pretty much always on the skull. So we're seeing sword strikes to the skull that are then creating radiating fractures, because the skull's thin. It's not meant to deal with huge amounts of force. It's essentially a container, a very mild protection for your brain. Obviously at the front we've got a lot more, and we'll talk about that where we don't see anything on those and touting in quite the same way. But around the back of the skull, it's relatively thin. It's domed, so it has no real direction of plane of structure for it to be able to absorb forces down. So when the swords hit, it cuts through, but as it's cutting through, it's just too much energy's in there. It deforms as it's cutting. That then becomes too excessive for the structure of the bone in that area, and we get these radiating fractures. They're very useful to us. They can start to show us the sequence of attacks and how things occurred due to where those fractures stop and intersect with either cuts or other fractures. That does leave us an interesting point, though, that we do see a lot of fracture, a lot of sharp force trauma onto the forearms within the mass grave, and we see these techniques being used in the manuals as well, where you're striking into the opponent's forearms as a preemptive defence to prevent them bringing their arms in. None of those are exhibiting any sign of sharp force trauma. Of blunt force trauma, only sharp force trauma. So we can presume by the time the sword connects with the bone, a huge amount of energy has been dissipated from the weapon as it's come in for whatever reason, or that it's just not there in the first place, is the alternative. I'll come to why we know and can say this later on. We're going to have a look at some axe wounds and how they're caused and what they create, and they do create fractures. So we're going to have a look at that, and realistically there's a lot of energy inside a moving sword, so it is a bit unusual perhaps that we don't see sharp force trauma combined with blunt force trauma on the arms, but we're looking at that next time, another time in the future. For now, so that's the finish of the blunt force trauma. Basically, blunt force trauma results in fractures of the bone. Bending and twisting fractures are the types of blunt force trauma we're likely to see, or types of fractures that we're likely to see. But realistically, blunt force trauma, it's going to leave bending fractures, and we're going to be looking at what they are and how they work later on. But we also know sharp force trauma can cause fractures as well. It's obviously going to be quite easy to tell the difference between pure blunt force and sharp force when examining skeletal remains. So, thank you very much for joining me. Hopefully that was a little bit of an insight, and we've moved forward a bit. Next time we're going to look at the sharp force trauma part of this article. We'll probably go into a little bit more detail because it is more relevant to us, and we'll start to introduce some of the terms that we're going to see appearing throughout our investigations here. So hopefully we'll see you then, and thanks for joining us. Bye.